any reduction in the status of the US dollar is going to be a slow erosion rather than a paradigm shift. So we're going to see that dollar dominance erode over time. That's because China is the largest trade partner of most economies, and as its economic might continues to rise, that means that it'll exert more influence in global financial institutions and trade, etc. The second reason is that several economies actually, they want to move to diversify. In an extreme case, you have Russia, for example, which is really looking to de-link itself from the US-led financial sector. We've seen that for years, and obviously with the sanctions, that's accelerated it. But you have other economies, such as the BRICS, or even ASEAN finance ministers recently saying we need to diversify against the dollar. And then the third one, which is less talked about, is central bank digital currencies and cryptocurrencies, for example, which will essentially see perhaps less use of general currencies, but that'll impact the US dollar.
Who then at this juncture is the most viable candidate currency to erode the dominance of the dollar in the longer term, Cedric, if it is heading in that direction?
So that's the challenge, and that's why we think it's going to be a very slow erosion, because the U.S. has this dominant position, not only in terms of the share of reserves, in terms of the share of FX transactions, trade, SWIFT payments, dollar-denominated debt. It's really, as you mentioned, a hegemony of the dollar. And in that sense, there's not really an alternative. If you think about it, the euro is somewhat of an imperfect fiscal and monetary union. The Japanese yen, which is another reserve currency, has all sorts of structural challenges in terms of the high debt loads, right, and the central bank, the role it plays in the economy. And even in terms of China, if you look at the yuan reserves as a share of total reserves, it's only about 2.5% of total reserves. And China still has current account restrictions. And so that means that it's going to take a long time for any other currency, any single currency, to really usurp the dollar from that perspective.
But you said a very important word here earlier in the conversation, that was diversification. When you consider how central banks of the world are diversifying their reserves, what is it telling you about the dollar's dominance in the global trading system?
Oh, certainly it's going to be eroded, right? As more economic powers emerge and there's more willingness to diversify. And that's also because, don't forget, over the past few quarters or so, up until October, the dollar saw huge strength. Right, and that was in response to the Fed's tightening cycle. And that put a lot of emerging market currencies under pressure and a lot of central banks under pressure. And what they want to do is to avoid that type of financial pressure from emerging in any one single go. So by diversifying their holdings of reserves into a more multi-currency sort of portfolio, perhaps they can reduce that pressure on their external sectors. Now, from China's perspective, it's a little bit more geopolitically driven, of course.